Bonjour tout le monde. Merci pour votre attention. Je pense que c'est une conférence de presse très importante. Il y a beaucoup de choses qui est maintenant, beaucoup de débats au sujet de le projet de loi omnibus sur le budget C-38, mais il y a beaucoup de choses qui sont cachées dedans son gros projet de loi. C'est dans le projet de loi et de plus en plus, je pense que les Canadiens comprenant que les conservateurs de M. Harper ont dissimulé un pléthore de mesures non budgétaires dans leur soi-disant projet de loi budgétaire de manière de les cacher en grand public et voir dérouter leurs représentants élus. As you know, most of us I think all of us in the opposition ranks are scandalized by the effort to hide so much within the 425-page Budget Implementation Act. My press release for today covers a lot of the environmental measures, and I'm open to questions on those. But in the time available, because as it now appears, due to time allocation, I will not be able to present in the House of Commons, as I had hoped to do, at second reading, a specific and detailed review of how particularly the changes to the Environmental Assessment Act and the Fisheries Act undermine an entire framework for federal engagement in protecting nature in Canada. So I'm going to try to get into it in some detail. I have prepared some schematics and I'll walk you through them. I thought I'd start with some history. C'est une histoire de moi-même comme militant écolo, parce que je suis occupée et engagée dans les revues environnementales depuis plus de presque 30 ans. I found this was the first environmental assessment I ever worked on. It's dated 1977. I've been working in environmental reviews since then. Initially, the first application of environmental assessment at the federal level in Canada was in 1974. In 1984, it was codified in something called the Environmental Assessment and Review Process, with the unfortunate acronym ERP. But that was a federal order in council that required that agencies of the federal government conduct environmental assessments when there were areas of federal jurisdiction involved. The terms were vague. They were clarified by the federal court in the late 80s. My own involvement included working in the Office of the Federal Minister of Environment from 86 to 88 as the government recognized that we needed to move from a guidelines order, which had some elements that were vague, to more precise legislation. And I actually, as a senior policy advisor to the Federal Minister of Environment, took our process through Privy Council office in the Mulroney government to get permission to legislate what is now being repealed, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. Another historical footnote of some note, when the Federal Minister of Environment, for whom I had nothing but affection and still hold in high regard, ignored the guidelines order and approved 2 dams in Saskatchewan without environmental review, I quit. So I've had a lot of personal involvement in environmental assessment. I've sacrificed a lot, not to put too fine a point on it, for proper environmental assessment. The result of my resignation was the court case that codified that the federal government had an obligation in law to perform environmental assessments under areas of federal jurisdiction pursuant to its own governor and council guidelines. So with that background, I now want to tell you that what this budget implementation bill is doing is undoing decades of work in developing clear legislative guidance for Canadian policymakers, for industry, for all elements of the regulatory and approval-making process. The environmental assessment process, as created in the early 90s, guaranteed the public elements of engagement. It is now being repealed. Where we are going, and I can't say it more clearly than this, is to undo decades of work by previous governments, particularly the government under Brian Mulroney, but then the government under Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, in perfecting a system of environmental review that would be predictable so industry knew what it was doing, and so that the regulation-making authorities within the federal government knew when they did or didn't have to do environmental assessment. It needs to be underscored that the C-38 Omnibus Budget Bill is repealing the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. The previous Assessment Act is here. It has been refined over the years. And to make it simpler, I have produced a one-sheet summary of the current process and how the law is being changed. Because all we've had, and I've got to step back and just say, I've never experienced anything like the callous disregard for proper information that is represented in the process that Stephen Harper has chosen to take for destroying environmental law. In the normal course of things, if you were repealing one act and replacing it with a completely different act, it would have been normal practice to have some kind of technical briefing. It would be normal to have some easy-to-follow guidance, a schematic that's easy to follow of what changes are being made. All we've received, of course, is in the budget itself, and I made some photocopies. It's at page 93, and it's been a deliberate effort on the part of Stephen Harper and his ministers to suggest to the media and to Canadians that all they're doing is adding timelines. They focus all the time on how long it's taken to do various reviews. It needs to be said, the previous system allowed for timelines. In fact, the federal provincial panel review on the cleanup of the Sydney tar ponds was given a timeline. The panel was told, we want this project done, we want the full panel review within a calendar year. That's possible under the law they are now repealing. There is nothing about timelines that required repealing the act. But all we've been given is a schematic of timelines. We've missed some rather large questions, and it's taken me a long time digesting the act to figure out how this is supposed to work in future. And it's my belief that what they've done is to make the process less predictable, more confusing, and I have a feeling a lot of people in industry are going to regret that they have a government that's so bullheaded and hell-bent on development that it didn't stop to figure out how to draft an act that people could follow. So first of all, under the current process, there's always been this notion of triggers to environmental assessment. When do you do a federal review? When do you not have to do a federal review? Typically, you always had to do a federal review if federal money was being used. You always did a federal review if federal land was involved. And then there's this other provision if there was, it used to be the general statement, federal jurisdiction involved. They codified that to a list of laws that contained triggers that focused on environmental review. Then the kinds of assessments you did. You might have a simple screening. You might go to a full environmental assessment followed by potentially a comprehensive study for really large projects, and occasionally and only rarely a federal joint, or sometimes federal review panel, sometimes joint federal provincial review panel. It needs to be said that over the decades of environmental assessment law, which I have tracked, there have been perhaps out of tens of thousands of reviews, 3 times that a federal review has led to a project being refused. It is not a cumbersome process that has held up development. You can ask yourself rhetorically, as Terry Glavin did in last weekend's Citizen, so I owe him this concept, but ask yourself, how often has the environmental movement slowed down development in the oil sense? And the answer is exactly not at all. Now, these regulatory pieces, the comprehensive study provisions, when you must do a comprehensive study, and the law list regulations, these are also scrapped. They're gone, okay? So now what do? Now what we have is triggers to environmental assessment no longer if federal money is used. That's gone. Federal land, okay, if there's federal land, you must do a review, but not of the entire project, just of the impact on federal land. Okay, that's a very significant retreat of federal engagement. And there's no law list. The kinds of EA, forget comprehensive studies, they're not included anymore. You go from a screening, which must be done within 45 days, that's a new provision, to an environmental assessment, which is undefined. All we know from the budget document, as opposed to the bill, is there's a description in the budget called standard environmental assessment. But the bill doesn't tell us what a standard environmental assessment is. Meanwhile, you can go to a panel. Rarely. That's up to the minister. Now, there's also federal discretion under the new bill to pass a review on to the province if the substitution is described as quote-unquote appropriate. But appropriate is not a defined term. There is no suggestion as to when it will be appropriate, when it won't be appropriate, and what kinds of criteria the minister might want to apply. I think it's completely possible that the substitution will be deemed appropriate if Environment Canada says, gee, it's short of money at the moment. It's appropriate to pass it on to the province. Very importantly, the content of review has also changed. It used to be that if you did a federal environmental assessment, and I've reproduced the definition of environment on this page, you looked at the whole environment. Now, in most cases, you're going to look at three things considered under federal jurisdiction: fish, migratory birds, and marine plants. Now, you can take it to a broader definition of environment if you're on federal land, or if the action of the project in one province is going to have extraterritorial, like outside that province, environmental effects, or if it's relating to Aboriginal peoples. Lastly, if you find a trigger that requires a federal permit to be provided, you can go to a broader definition of environment, but in a very, very narrowly defined sense, only to the effect that that particular permit causes that exact environmental damage. Lastly, why are there so many acts in here being changed? If you go to the law list they've just scrapped and go to the sections of every different act, Fisheries Act, Canadian Environment Protection Act, you'll find that those sections that triggered environmental reviews are the very sections that the Budget Omnibus Bill is changing. The most egregious of these, of course, is removing the protection of habitat for fish in our common understanding of what a fish is. It essentially has created an incentive by not protecting the habitat at all of any fish that are not currently being used by humans, whether those humans are fishing commercially, fishing recreationally, or are Aboriginal Canadians. Those are the only fish that are having any habitat protection applied at all. If you are looking at a fishery that's commercial, recreational, or Aboriginal, the habitat can still be altered substantially with no requirement for review, because they've changed the restrictions around habitat even for commercial, Aboriginal, and recreational fisheries. That takes me to the last point, which is this. By not protecting the habitat of fish not currently being used by humans, we have accidentally, I'm sure, created an incentive so that a mining company that might want to create, as we know, the prospects such as Fish Lake, take a lake that exists, fill it with mine tailings. It's allowed to be done under Schedule 2 of SEPA. It'll actually be quicker and easier and cheaper to drain the lake and kill all the fish, because there's no protection for fish or their habitat if no one's fishing them. Then you have a big dry hole and you can fill it with tailings. This act is so wrong-headed. I've just touched on the surface of what's in this Budget Omnibus Bill, and it is an absolute outrage that the Conservatives have rejected the calls, which I supported from the official opposition, to pull out all the sections that have nothing to do with fiscal management, fiscal prudence, and a budget, but have everything to do with destroying environmental law that took 30 years to create. Thank you. I'll take questions. Je suis un peu fâchée. Désolée. Il y a des questions? Non? Parce que ici aussi, je fais un petit résumé en français pour ça aussi. Avec le projet de loi C-38, le gouvernement de M. Harper a décidé d'éliminer, annuler beaucoup de processus dans les lois pour protéger l'environnement. Il en fait un grand, comme un retraite. Il a quitté la juridiction pour beaucoup de choses pour protéger la nature, et seulement fixé pour une définition très, très, très petite pour seulement les choses qui sont dans la Constitution fédérale, et pas pour les uniquement, et pas pour l'environnement, quand tout le monde comprend le mot environnement, et quand dans le projet de loi actuellement pour protéger l'environnement, qui était dans la définition ici, c'est un environnement plus grand dans la façon de l'air, de l'eau, des forêts. Maintenant, c'est seulement les poissons et les eaux migratoires, les oiseaux migratoires. Alors, maintenant, je pose pour une question, non? Yeah.
What options do you have?
We have a lot of options as parliamentarians. My particular access to an option relates to what I can do at report stage. I cannot be on the Finance Committee as a member. I cannot be on the subcommittee of finance as a member. I am in the very bizarre situation, and I don't want to exaggerate my credentials by any means. I'm not the most knowledgeable person in Canada on federal environmental assessment law. I am most likely the most knowledgeable parliamentarian on federal environmental assessment law, and I couldn't get in to speak on the budget because of the NDP 3-day speech, and I can't get in to speak at second reading on C-38. But I have an ironic benefit. Maybe it's not irony, maybe it's just good luck. But as a member of Parliament who's not sitting on committees, I do have the right to put forward amendments at report stage. And I have a superior right to put forward amendments at report stage compared to members of Parliament who are on the committees. So we're working very diligently. There are many sections of this disastrous bill that concern me. They go well beyond the environmental sections. I certainly am very concerned about the old age security sections. I'm concerned about what they're doing to change the laws around charities. I'm concerned about removing the oversight of the Canadian Security Intelligence Agency. Every place where I have a concern, we will be working diligently to put forward amendments. It'll be up to the Speaker to rule whether they are in order or not. But as long as I can find a seconder, and as long as my amendments are sufficiently supported to create the right of a vote, I think the Conservatives might want to rethink insisting that this whole bill go forward as an omnibus bill covering 70 acts. I had 42 amendments ruled in order on the omnibus crime bill, and had I insisted that we stay and vote on each one of them, we would have been there till 3 in the morning. I'm not backing down on this. However many amendments the Speaker rules are in order, as long as I can find parliamentary support to make sure my amendments are seconded, I will not back down, and we will not be there till 4 in the morning. We could be there for days. So for that, I need some cooperation from at least a couple more MPs.
That is just to raise awareness?
No, the point of that, well, once the voting starts, no one can leave their chair. That is a situation of physical challenges. The House Leader for the Conservatives did ask me before the omnibus crime bill to only put forward some, because he said the physical challenges for his caucus would be extreme. He actually said, do I have to go out and buy Depends for my caucus now? You can't leave your chair at all. So that's one thing I can do. I can try. Thank you very much. And I hope this has all helped explain things. We'll put all of these explanations and the codified explanation of the new flow, which, by the way, is very consistent with an excellent story in today's Globe and Mail that tries to explain it. But this is more detailed in terms of how they've really changed the Environmental Assessment Act. This isn't about shortening the time it takes to do projects. This is about avoiding doing projects, doing assessments. This is avoiding assessments, not just shortening the time it takes to do them. Thanks very much.